Well, over the past 7 weeks, the children have been focusing on the 7 signs of Jesus in John's Gospel. 7 incredible miracles that show us that Jesus is the Son of God, and that if we believe in Jesus, we believe that he's the Son of God, we'll have eternal life. And to help us to wrap up this Sunday School series, it's over to Ed Lowis now, who's going to conclude it for us.
Morning, boys and girls. It's really good to see you this morning. We've got today a special children's talk when we're going to do a big roundup of all the talks that we've looked at over the last 7 weeks. If you remember, we've been looking at stories, true stories, that John wrote down in his book of the Bible, telling us about amazing signs or miracles that Jesus did. Now, if we were at church, at chapel together today, what would happen is this. I would go through my 7 props, which we'll come to in a minute, and if you did a good job of remembering some of the stories, possibly all of the stories if you're really old, then I would very kindly have given you some sweets or perhaps a nice bar of chocolate to say, well done, you've worked really hard. However, we're not at church at the moment, so I can't give you any chocolate or sweets. I'll have to eat that for myself. And instead, your parents, very kindly, will get you some sweets or chocolate or something nice if you do a good job remembering the 7 stories. So parents, you need to be prepared. Let's have a look at the 7 props and see if you can remember which stories they talk about. We're going to start at the top of my bookcase, at this one here, which is a bottle of red wine. Can you remember what story that goes to? Then a bit lower down on my bookcase, I've got a fish finger sandwich. Which story talked about fishes and bread? Next to the fish finger sandwich, we've got a toilet roll, which really is supposed to represent the bandages that you might wrap someone up in when they're dead, like an Egyptian mummy. Which story does that go to? Next to that, we've got 2 cards. Remember, we did a story where you have to make sure you get the right reaction to what happens, that you don't send the wrong card to the wrong person at the wrong time. Can you remember what story that goes to? Then, just next to my head here, we've got a map of Bury St Edmunds, and we did a story that took place in one place and something happened miles away. And I think I said it was from Bury to Haverhill. What happened then? Which miracle does that go to? We've also got our Westgate Chapel News microphone when we interviewed some people. Can you remember which story that was? There was some bad acting that went on in that story. And last but not least, we have a disco dancing gnome who's trying to float in water, but he's sinking. Can you remember which story that goes to? So there are 7 props and 7 stories that we have looked at, and perhaps your parents might pause later on in the week and you can try and have a work out which story goes with which. But boys and girls, all these stories we know are miracles. And all these stories were written by John. And why did he do that? He wrote these stories down, he saw them, he wrote them down to prove that Jesus was truly God's Son. And because Jesus is God's Son, you can trust in him. He can get you to heaven if you are his friend. And we know from these miracles that prove that Jesus was God's Son, that Jesus, when he died on the cross to take away my sins and your sins, was able to do that because he was God's Son, and that he came back to life 3 days later. Another ultimate miracle to prove who he was. So these all linked together. In fact, John, if I get my Bible down, says this. I love this, and this is why we're next to a bookcase today. John says this, right at the end of the book of John, the final 2 verses, he says this. This is the disciple, John, who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. John says, I saw all these miracles. I'm not making it up. It's a true story. And then he says this. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. We've got enough evidence, enough stories, enough miracles to prove that Jesus is God's Son. And that's why we've looked at these 7 signs over these last few weeks. Don't forget to try and tell your parents which each prop goes with which story. And we'll see you next week.